The aim of this session is to give you an update on the current guidance and where we're at with regards to COVID restrictions, and particularly the hope that many of you will have about running residential activities over the summer. I think the first thing to say is that obviously this has been a uniquely challenging year, but I'm incredibly proud of the way that the movement as a whole has responded to keep things going and keep in touch with our young people and be ready to respond with innovation and with enthusiasm to everything that's been thrown at us. And I think that's one of the things that makes this organisation something very special. And although it's been incredibly difficult for all of us, it's been extremely positive to be supporting so much good work to carry on, even in the face of the biggest challenge to our ways of working that there's been in our movement since the Second World War, and that doesn't go unacknowledged by all of our stakeholders, by everyone that we work with. I think this is going to be a story of two parts. We are going to have to be realistic about the situation that we find ourselves and the very real challenges of that, but we have to plan to deliver the best that we can and to make the best of the opportunities that are presented them to us this summer, which is why I thought of Gramsci, and pessimism of the intelligence, but optimism of the will, which I'm afraid will be the watchwords for what we're about to outline and the restrictions that we're continuing to operate under over the summer. Just a quick summary of where we're at. Vaccination rollout is meaning that there is more immunity within the community. Infection rates are stable with that R number broadly, roughly equal to 1. But against that background of good news, there is the emergence, as was expected, of variants to the virus. There are emerging regional hotspots, which I know some of you will be only too aware of. There is already the conversation about possible local lockdowns in England, and a continuing picture of transmission being high in school-age children, which is one of the reasons that when we start to think about it, the situation we find ourselves in, where the youth work sector may be under tighter restrictions than those that we can engage with as families or as private individuals, begins to make a bit of sense. I found this a rather striking statistic. So this is Bolton, which is one of those regional hotspots, and the dotted line is the infection rate in the 60+ age group, and the green line is the infection rate in Elfins, basically. So when I tell you that we are still under stricter restrictions than we would like to be, there's a really good reason for it, and we need to all bear that in mind because it's not over yet. Just to give you a reminder of where we are, and most of you I hope will have had an update by email about this guidance. We are now in England at step 3, which means that we can meet indoors or outdoors. Obviously indoors is subject to much stricter controls in terms of face coverings and washing regimes and all of those sorts of things. While there is no upper limit on the numbers that we can work with, bubbles of 15 are advised to kind of keep things manageable. And at stage 3 at the moment, the only camping and residential activity that is permitted is extremely small expeditions. Basically, you're talking Duke of Edinburgh expeditions and things of that sort. It is not compatible at all with Woodcraft's ways of working, and therefore we can't sanction group camps and residentials while we're at step 3 in England. In Scotland, the country has moved to protection level 2 or level 3 if you're in Glasgow due to local conditions. In Scotland, indoor and outdoor provision is permitted. there are maximum numbers, which include volunteers, at and within level 2 areas and below. It is possible to go camping currently, but the Scottish guidance indicates that there has to be single occupancy or single household occupancy of tents or dormitories, which means realistically camping in a woodcraft-like manner with elfins and pioneers in such a way as they're supported and safeguarded is going to be very challenging indeed. The only camps I know that are happening in Scotland at the moment are those targeted only at adventurers, which I think is prudent. And we're working closely with Scottish groups to try and make sure that that happens where we've been told about it in as safe a way as possible. Within Wales, the whole nation is at alert level 2, which does again permit indoor or outdoor provision. There is no upper limit on numbers, but again, we're advising bubbles of 15 to keep things safe and manageable. Camps and residentials are permitted, but only with that single occupancy of tents or sleeping spaces. So again, the same challenges exist. And one of the challenges through all of this has been managing the various differences between the regulations in the different bits of the devolved nations, which I'm sure you appreciate adds another layer of complexity when one part of the organisation can do something and the other can't. In terms of what we know now about what will happen next, we have no timeline for the next lifting of restrictions in Wales. The Scottish Government have indicated that protection level 1 will be followed by, hopefully, by protection level 0 on the 28th of June, but even that is not a return to normal, and there will still be restrictions on our activities. Scotland, while they've published the timeline, they haven't published detailed guidance about what that will look like in terms of the youth sector. At the moment, the guidance applies to level 1, 2, or 0 areas. But if the entire of Scotland moves to protection level 0 along that timeline, we may see some restrictions lifting on our work, which may mean it is possible for us to have something more approaching a woodcraft camp, but we will not know until, if things follow the pattern that's been happening, we will not know until after that date whether we can go ahead, which I realise is perilously close to the beginning of school summer holidays in June in Scotland. In England, we've been told to expect step 4 not before the 21st of June. It may be significantly after that, and reading between the lines, I think there is a little bit of tension between the political will to hit the published timeline and the public health desire to follow the data and the science, and we just have to watch this space. What we have been given at the moment is an outline of what step 4 might look like in terms of restrictions on the youth sector. We expect this to be confirmed shortly before we move to that step 4 stage. So we've been given an outline date of the 18th of June when we might be given the final guidance about what we can and can't do over the summer. As that's the bit of detail that we can share that's not currently out in the public domain, that's what I'm going to focus on principally. And we can come back to what might happen and might be possible in the devolved nations at the end, if that's okay. So sorry to Scottish and Welsh colleagues who are on the call. So our understanding at the moment from what's been shared with us by the National Youth Agency is that the limit for the numbers that can participate in residential activity will be raised from its current 6, but it will not be raised anywhere near as high as we would like it to be. The limit, we have been told, 15 is a conservative estimate, 30 would be a real win. There may yet be possible regional variance on that, depending what happens in the next couple of weeks with variants of concern. but we've been told to prepare for the idea that the very largest gathering we can hold under canvas this year will be 30 people. I realise this is not the information you logged on hoping to get. As I said, we won't know before mid-June what the restrictions are going to be. One thing that is certain is that you will be required, if you're taking a youth group away, to conduct lateral flow tests, swabs and things. And we've been given, Lauren will correct me if I'm wrong, but every 48 hours or
between 48 and 72 hours, yeah.
Okay, so if you were going to go away for a week's test, you would be expected to test at least a couple of times during that.
And test before you leave for the camp, and also when you return back from the camp as well.
Okay. It is possible for groups to use the same campsite and the same centre, but there will be a strict requirement that there's to be no mixing of groups if you're in the same site. So popping round someone else's campfire, or dare I say adults going on run ashore to the nearest licensed premises, will not be on, and that will be one of the most challenging aspects if you do go camping in somewhere where there are other young people, that there should be absolutely no mixing, whether you're using the same campsite or the same centre. And there's a whole raft of guidance about how you need to manage that with dining facilities and toilets and washrooms and all the rest of it. And the other thing that was just kind of dropped casually into the end of the update for the youth sector the other day was the notion that we would be either required or strongly discouraged from having camping and residential activities for young people in the last 2 weeks of the English summer holidays. The intention being to limit the likelihood of any cross transmission before children went back to school, because obviously them all being at school is the important thing, rather than them having positive experiences with their peers over summer. So again, we won't know until the middle of June whether that is an absolute requirement or whether that's something we're going to be asked nicely to do. But that's certainly going to be a feature that we're going to have to prepare for. So if you have things scheduled for those 2 weeks, last 2 weeks of the holidays, that will be something you need to bear in mind as well. On that basis, we understand that everybody will be desperate to get away if they possibly can. And I know some of you have already made some plans. I know many of you have listened carefully to us saying, don't make any big commitments, and have negotiated good terms and good cancellation deals with particularly kind of campsites run by Woodcraft Folk and run by the Scouts and other organisations who are in the same boat and are sympathetic to where you're coming from. The possible approaches that you can be thinking about, therefore, are groups rather than district camps. The thing to say is, in England, we are not being given an indication that there will be a requirement for single sleeping spaces. All of that other stuff, the lateral flow testing and the requirement for very restricted numbers, is the quid pro quo for that is that we expect that you will be able to put young people together in tents in groups of 2 or 3 or however you do, which means that we are in a better position in England than Scotland to run something that looks more like a Woodcraft camp, although it will be very small indeed. So you may have the opportunity to go away as an Elfin group, as a Pioneer group, providing the numbers do not breach that cap. You may find it easier to go away for a shorter duration, for a 2 or 3 night camp, whereas you might have done a week in the summer, not least because the requirements to do regular testing and things will be more more demanding. And obviously, the more time you're there for, the more time you're in the field interacting among that group of people, the more chance there is that there will be transmission or an outbreak or something that you will then, you'll then challenge to deal with. We are being encouraged by the sector at all times to think and to balance the risk of doing stuff with the benefits of doing stuff. The lowest risk in terms of transmission of coronavirus would be for everyone to stay home and do no youth work. We know that's not acceptable because our young people need connections with their peers and they need experiences outdoors and they need connections with important non-parent adults. But if you feel you can do that within a 2-night camp, do a 2-night camp. Don't do a 7-night week because that's what you've always done if you think 2 or 3 nights will be enough. The alternative is to think about running day camps, activity days on a different model, so they are more like extended group nights because there are no limits to the numbers. You can manage things in bubbles, but there is not the same scrutiny about whether you've got the same adults working with the same bubbles consistently throughout the day and so on, because it's really the overnight thing that is causing that concern. There will still be a need to think about the transmission risk. There'll still be a need to think about what you do about sharing equipment and sanitizing surfaces and providing toilet facilities and feeding people and all of that stuff. But you will be doing so within a slightly more generous regime of restrictions. And the final alternative is delaying until autumn, when hopefully we will be under less restriction and potentially, although the weather is cooler, there may be the opportunity to use outdoor centres and things rather than camping under canvas. But you will also have more time and more certainty about what the restrictions will look like, and more ability to plan for the expected rather than having to do what we're doing at the moment, which is hoping for the best and planning for the worst. Lauren, I'm going to hand over to you now to just talk through what our current thinking is around the planned events that we were going to stage at Biblins in the summer. If that's okay.
That's okay. Thank you, Owen. So for those who don't know, and I think many of you do know of the people that I can see that are here, but we were planning to deliver 2 national camps this summer, one for pioneers and one for venturers, both taking place at Biblins between the 2nd and the 13th of August. We're now rethinking some of the plans, but hopefully not to just be a kind of downheartening part of this session. I haven't come here just to bring completely bad news, so that's hopefully a good thing. But we're looking, first of all, looking at the pioneer camps. With pioneers, the pioneers themselves wouldn't need to be doing the testing every 3 days or 2 or 3 days, but obviously anybody over the age of, well, some of the pioneers might need to, but most of them wouldn't. But anybody over the age of 11 would need to test every few days. So maybe, as Owen kind of alluded to before, we're thinking of making the camp slightly shorter. So obviously people can have the opportunity to book in for the whole time between the 2nd and the 7th, or they could just decide to come for the first couple of days or the last few days of that period. As Owen also said, the bubbles are looking like they need to be limited to be a lot smaller. So as our traditional camps might look, with villages of lots of people and sharing food and sharing cooking and sharing lots of different equipment and walking over to a different village and saying hello and borrowing some sugar or anything like that, and playing some wide games together, is not going to be so possible. So we're thinking of making it more of a family bubble kind of camp where young people can come along with their families, with some adults in a smaller group, whether that be a small group of 15 people, including the adults who are with them, so maybe 13 pioneers and 2 adults, or a smaller kind of family bubble group, and book in that way. That kind of brings up a few questions about things like food and program, but we're again looking at alternative ideas of maybe having activity sessions that go on with lots of activities that are very similar to what might have gone on at a national camp where everybody could be together, but that young people can take part in their smaller bubble groups and kind of book a slot in with those activities, which will be led by staff and volunteers who will be sort of separate from any other bubble who's on the camp, so they'll be able to interact with different bubbles throughout the day. I think that's that one. Can we go to the next slide?
Oh yes, sorry.
It's all right. I just clicked it on my screen as well, and then I thought I'm not sharing that with everybody else. And then looking at the Ventura camp, which was due to happen between the 7th and the 13th of August, we have been thinking hard about this, but we know that for many venturers who want to come to a camp with other venturers, it's all about meeting venturers from other parts of the UK, other parts of your region, and other parts of the country as a whole. So it's very unlikely that it will meet the needs and wants of venturers who have come for an experience to meet other venturers when we sort of say you're not allowed to communicate with people outside of your bubble. And if that's the case, then for some people traveling all the way to Biblins to only be able to communicate with those people who are in their local group anyway might seem just a bit kind of carrot and stick tormenting. And it might be harder for adults and leaders to sort of police how much interaction goes on. And at that point, it just becomes not the experience that venturers or adults have come along for. So we will consider this a lot more when the next set of guidance comes out, because we're still unsure what the bubble numbers would be. If the bubble numbers are over 30 and sort of still very unlikely that might happen, but if it were to be a bit over 30, then we might consider that there could be sort of smaller villages, maybe with more than one venturer group, but it would need a lot more consideration, and we can't make any decision on that until the next guidance has been released. So what we're sort of hoping is that there will be some shared autumn residentials, as Owen said, when things maybe are looking a bit more clear on what we know we can expect from a residential, where we can send groups to our centres where there'll be activities put on for them and they can meet other venturers in that way and in that space. Did I miss anything out there, Owen, that you think I should have said?
No, I think that's very helpful. Just to say, I mean, there is a small group of volunteers who have been taking this forward, and they're meeting again tomorrow, as I think Lauren mentioned. And after that, we will have some FAQs which we'll post for wider consumption about the events, so that if you are still considering, or you've already talked about tentatively booking, you'll be able to share those with your young people, with your parents and carers, and with your fellow leaders as well. As Lauren says, we will be looking to crank up whatever we can within the restrictions to satisfy people's appetite to get away and do camping the Woodcraft way. We are currently not optimistic about what we'll be able to deliver, and as Lauren said, particularly the extent to which it's going to meet the aspirations of venturers. I know that there were, for example, groups from as far away as Scotland thinking that coming down to Biblins would be something that's worth doing. I have to say, for venturers coming down to only spend the time with venturers that they could have spent time with in Glasgow is not looking like a viable proposition. So I'm sure there will be many other groups making the same kind of judgments as we get closer and as we know what those numbers look like. The good news, though, Paulina, are you still with us? Do you want to just quickly talk to the plans for 2022? just to give us all something that we can look forward to.
Yes, happy to say that the relaunch of Common Ground 2022 is happening on Wednesday, and things are looking a lot brighter. We still have a massive amount of interest from our international delegations from close by and further afield. So we are feeling happy about the new event site. A lot of the work that happened before the pandemic hit has not been wasted, and we are really lucky that the young adults who are on the board of the meeting of the event are still engaged and happy to deliver the project successfully next summer.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paulina. I'm just conscious that people need to go. If Lewisham and Greenwich people are still here, have you got any questions very, very quickly that you want us to address before you run off to your district meeting? Or have you all gone? Ros, you're still here. I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, I did say we'd come back to talking about the devolved nations. As I said earlier, I'm at the moment don't know what the restrictions are going to look like at the next stage, because whilst we tend to get the next stage of the restrictions sort of trailed with us in England, in Scotland and Wales, the sector has tended to be much more responsive. I am working, obviously, in Glasgow at level 3. Nothing is possible at the moment in terms of residentials. I am working with a group in Edinburgh who are going to be effectively the kind of pilot for running a small venture camp under the restrictions as they currently stand, as they've stood from the 31st of May. And after that, we will come back and share the experience of that and the kind of risk assessments and the measures that were put in place and what worked and what didn't, and what needed improved, to hopefully support the idea of camps happening in Scotland. I know in Scotland there's also a tentative booking for a camp in, is it early July, Kath?
Yes, probably. Yeah, so there's a tentative booking, like you mentioned. There's good relations with the Scouts, the Scout campsite that we use. They're not looking for a deposit. They're in the same position, so if it happens, it happens. As you say, it's very unlikely. We don't feel we can run a camp with single occupancy. It just wouldn't be a Woodcraft Folk camp, and we're not in a position that we want to exclude anybody. So if people are excluded, we're all excluded, essentially. But there are plans, as you said, alternative plans for either a full day at the same campsite, a day camp, whatever you want to call it, and or a more local, sort of central Scotland, local, when I say local, local to where our camping equipment is stored on a farm, where we may have small bivvy groups over the period of the week that we would have had a week-long camp normally, which, you know, that fits all of the alternatives that you gave.
Yeah, I mean, bivvying, if that meets the appetite, bivvying or sleeping in hammocks or some other outdoor sleeping accommodation, because it is the idea of people sharing the same sleeping space that's concerning. That is a model that you can also approach that I hadn't thought about really, which is a really good one, particularly if you've already got that level of kit and bushcrafty knowledge and skills floating around in your district. Not sure I would have been up for that as an elfin, but hey, why not? Why not? Freedom strongly.
We've had sort of test bivvies where we've camped on the Scout site. Essentially, we've bivvied in the next field, and the elfins think that they're 100 miles away. because he can't see the kitchen tent, and they're just so happy.
Fantastic. I've got some questions coming in on
Should I
chat.
read it to you?
Somebody's spotting my typos, which is always helpful. Tom says, if the group bubble limit is likely to imply to people staying overnight, could you do an open day so that people, non-camping children, new to Woodcraft, coming into the daytime to get a text to the camping park? Do you know what I love about the organisation? You give a set of guidelines and you're immediately thinking how you can get around them. I love it. We would have to take that away and possibly ask for clarification from the NYA.
If it's a day event, I believe that it's just like an extended. If you're only there in the daytime, then it's the same as a group night. The rule.
I think the point is, if we had some people staying over, we maxed it out staying over, and then we piled another 30 people in at breakfast time. My feeling is, even if that obeys
I think
the letter of the regulations, it's not the spirit.
I think
the idea is that if a camping group isn't going to mingle, and there's effectively no difference between mingling with people who are sleeping in their own beds to mingling with people who happen to be sleeping in the other side of the campsite, if you see what I mean. So I love the idea. I love the innovation, but I think that would be caning it a little bit. But as the next level of guidance, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
It's Ian. If we know if the bubbles, whether they be 15 or up to 30, is that just children, or would that involve adults as well in those?
No, that will be adults and children.
Okay.
You haven't mentioned residential centres. Is that just completely out of the question, like Lockabrook or?
The same guidance will apply whether you're under canvas or whether you're in a residential centre. The challenge with residential centres is that they will, obviously, with the exception of Cudham and Lockabrook, they will be run by external bodies who will have their own approaches and will have their own set of risk protocols and so on. Certainly in Scotland, we're being told it's for single group occupancy only. In England, we're being told that large centres could accommodate a number of groups, but again, no mixing between groups that happen to be using the same centre. And the idea is you'd have to either take shifts in the dining halls and things like that. You'd have to have segregated facilities so that you weren't using the same toilets or showers as other groups, or weren't doing so at the same time, and they were cleaned in between. So there's a whole nother layer of complexity within that. Debs, have you got anything to say about Woodcraft centres and their preparations?
At the moment, I highly recommend people to use Woodcraft folk centres because they're small enough that they will only fit in one bubble. All the centres are looking at their calendars to schedule in activity weekends where we will run programme for groups who want to come, and we'll put together a calendar of dates from July right through to October. And we will be supporting people to engage in some kind of Woodcraft folk residential experience. But the thing that doesn't make any sense with the latest guidance is that they are treating an indoor residential centre in exactly the same way as they're treating a field. So if you bivvied, they are seeing that as equally as risky as sharing a dorm with 12 other people, which clearly doesn't make sense, but that's the guidance we're currently working with. Now, things may change, but I think we have to be cautious.
Thank you, Deb. I'm just going back over questions that have been submitted in the chat. Edwina has said, In step 4, with residential numbers increased to 15, is there any restriction on how many people per bedroom at Cudham? We do not know for certain, but at the moment, we haven't been told that there will be a restriction on how many people share rooms. There may be restrictions on how close people can be within bedrooms, which means that there's a de facto limit on how many you can fit in a bedroom. But my understanding is that, to some extent, whereas in Scotland and Wales the approach is single occupancy of bedrooms to reduce transmission, the approach in England is rather more vested in the idea of testing people before you go and testing people regularly when you're there, to kind of exclude the possibility that anybody has coronavirus. And therefore, it's not quite you can do whatever you like when you're away, but those mitigation measures that would stop spread are less significant in terms of how transmission would be controlled, if that makes sense. When they, at the moment, because the numbers are so low, that they're allowed to use the centre, then practically it doesn't occur. If there is going to be a limit introduced, then we'll find that out on the 18th of June, along with everything else about what the next step looks like. Just for those who might be wondering, there was, we were originally told, and we had been told up until last week, that step 4 would be the point where everything goes back to normal in England and there's no restrictions on anything. That has clearly gone out of the window as far as the youth work sector is concerned, and we are, being told, as some of us had kind of confidently predicted, that we would need to expect and plan for a step 5, if not also a step 6, before we're out of the other side of this. Any other questions that people want to chuck in at the moment?
So, question Teddington, Jill Allen had put in the chat that if you divided your group into 2, would that mean that you had to have separate leaders for each group? Could you answer that?
The guidance allows you to have leaders from one group. So from Jill's example of dividing the district into two overnight camps, that was your example, wasn't it, Jill? Yeah, you could have a group of leaders do Monday to Wednesday with 15 young people, and then do Thursday to Friday, Saturday with another 15. We would advise you that they would take a lateral flow test in between, and we would advise you to have reserve leaders just in case anybody had close contact with COVID and would have to isolate, but that would be possible.
But would it be possible to have 2 separate camps on the same site, not mixing with separate leaders? You couldn't have the same leaders, you'd have to have separate leaders.
It depends on how you define leader, Pippa. So the guidance allows instructors to go from one bubble to another. So if you had a climbing instructor, you could do one group in the morning and another group in the afternoon. It's not best practice because clearly it increases the risk of infection from one group to the other. But I'm not sure which roles on a Woodcraft Folk camp would suit the mixing from one group to the other. It seems more logical that you would keep your leaders with your clan together for the whole event.
Okay, thank you.
It is, I mean, it's quite difficult because clearly the guidance has been written for all types of youth work, and we're all slightly different in the way that we approach residentials.
If your district was big enough, Debs, and you had enough leaders, you could have 2 bubbles on the same campsite at the same time, as long as they didn't mix.
As long as they didn't mix and they didn't share the same bathrooms, or you thoroughly cleaned bathrooms between one group and the other. So it's about your confidence level in keeping those bubbles separate and your willingness to go, no, you can't go and talk to that person. You can only talk to this person in your bubble.
I would go so far as to say that if that was the situation you were in, you might do better to do camps in two separate fields, separated by a few miles, just because I've worked with young people and indeed our valued volunteers long enough to know that it's possible that the temptation might just prove too much of an evening when there's a campfire and the stars are out, and dare I say, if drink had been taken. And we don't want to give up our annual leave to go and provide experiences for our young people and then spend the entire time policing restrictions.
So, yeah, so this brings to another question. At Park Farm last year, they did bubble camping throughout the summer, which basically you came with your family group and you bubble camped. Now, if we did, the restrictions this year are less for family groups. So if you had a family group that went camping, none of these restrictions would apply, would they?
We are definitely of the situation where there are greater restrictions for organised youth work than there are for the general public.
So if we had a family camp, where we had the parents there as well, you could get around all of this.
Not all of it.
If you ran a family camp where children were coming only with their parents and sleeping in family bubbles, you can have more people on your site, but there's still an expectation that you designate different facilities and people are not using them at the same time and all of those things. But what you can't then do is go and now we're all going to go and do a merry moot in this big tent over here or whatever, because
we can't do this, by the way, but
I think we can't. I think the situation we want to avoid is where we're saying that we're running one sort of provision between 8 o'clock at night and 5 o'clock in the morning, and when the sun comes up, we switch and we go, oh no, we're not running a commercial campsite on family bubble lines now. We're running an activity day, because I think we'll quite rightly get called out for playing both ends against the middle. I think we need to decide which model. Are we going to effectively try and provide experiences for as many families as possible by opening our centres to family bubbles because we can't run organised youth camps? Or are we going to do the best that we can to run activity days on those sites using those resources? We kind of can't have people moving seamlessly from one to the other, because effectively it's not living within the spirit of the guidance that we've been asked to work within. Tom, you are waving. Can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't know what we do about the wide game, because that involves other participants from other camps and other sectors then. So we would have to do somehow, we need to somehow involve other kids from other places to be able to do that.
Sorry, are you talking about a thing that's already been planned somewhere?
Yeah, about wide game, because obviously where we're going to youthful camps, we work it with the other venturers, pioneers, and if all one is separated, then it's going to be difficult for us to do that.
Yeah, a whole camp wide game, if we have multiple bubbles coming together, a whole camp wide game is not going to be a reality. Unless it involves judicious use of lots of semaphore and communicating at a distance. That might be an opportunity. It's everybody's chance to learn semaphore.
That sounds good.
Couple of questions. Bronwyn's asking, can provisional information be shared widely? It's not yet made more broadly public. I mean, we can certainly talk to our stakeholders, to parents, to families, to other volunteers, about the restrictions that we've announced and the broad expectations. But I think it must be couched in the idea that we are by no means clear what these are the possibilities that have been shared with us, rather than on this day this will happen. So as long as it's shared in that spirit, that's fine. Lewis was asking, at London Region has advertised a Pioneer Camp weekend in mid-July. I don't know anything about a Pioneer Camp weekend with London Region in mid-July, but it would be a good thing to find out who's organising that. Does anyone know who the kind of key contacts for that are?
It's I think it's a Park Farm weekend.
Park Farm, right? Okay.
Tom Searle would be the contact.
On track. We will not know until very shortly before that what restrictions we're operating under. So I'm sure it will be possible for it to go ahead in some way, shape, or form. It might be worth sharing the outcomes of the discussions about what we might be doing for pioneers in Biblins with the team that is organising that, just in case it's helpful to kind of to compare notes and triangulate, because it will have to be operated in a way that is compliant. I realise it's incredibly difficult when you're trying to get people to book in to commit to stuff that we can't tell you what's going to be legal next week. But that's the reality of the situation we're operating under. But it's, to be honest, at the moment, the more we know about what people have got planned or tentatively booked, the better, so that we can kind of watch the horizon and talk to the right people as soon as we know and as soon as we've got updates. So I will add that to the list of things that we know are tentatively booked, along with those of you who've already emailed this afternoon to tell me about what you've got going on. Are there any other questions that we haven't addressed that we can realistically answer, like not to do with the next stage that we've said repeatedly we don't know about? I can hear somebody. I'm not sure if that's a question or whether that's noise is off, but if you've got a question, holler or put it in the chat. As I said, the next step will be for us to put some frequently asked questions together and share after the camp planning meeting tomorrow. We will also put the recording and the notes and summarise the outcomes from this discussion on the COVID updates page that has been sitting on the bottom of my slides all along, on the Woodcraft website, so that all the information that you need is in one place. Thank you very much for coming and for the job that you're about to do, disseminating that to your fellow leaders in your groups and districts. I'm sorry it wasn't the news that you were hoping for. We had hoped to share some more positive news as well. I have every confidence that groups and districts will find ways to work within the restrictions that we're working within, and continue to do everything that we can to give young people an outdoor experience over the summer. As Lauren said earlier, we will look to organising more stuff rooted in our own centres through the autumn term, so that people will have more opportunities to come away with Woodcraft Folk, hopefully when things ease a little bit more. And again, to focus on also the opportunities that are presented by Common Ground when all this is over and hopefully consigned to history. And we can have a very large celebration of everything that the movement is and will continue to be. Dismal but illuminating. Thank you. It's not the feedback I strive for, but it's very very comforting at the moment. Becca says, in planning day camp at Cudham, we'd love some suggestions for activities we can do in one day. We'll think about it. I mean, I would absolutely hit Dream Big at Home for suggestions of stuff, but I think there's a really good question about what you could do. Sometimes we go away to camp and we do stuff that, you know, does, like tie-dye is the absolute example that, you know, takes kind of 2 days to see through. There must be stuff that kind of takes a day but longer than an hour and a half. It would be really good. Do you know, this is exactly the sort of thing where the Woodcraft Facebook page comes in handy. Chuck that out as a question, you'll get half a dozen answers within an hour, I promise you. But we'll certainly think of anything that that comes to mind and share as well. Yes, we will stick the slides straight on the website as well, on that COVID updates page. It will probably take us a little bit longer to turn the video around because it needs editing and stitching together and so on. But I'll put the slides on there first thing tomorrow so that they're there for you to disseminate to your groups. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for your time. I'm sorry there wasn't more in it for you. We will of course keep you updated as things change, particularly those of you who are operating in areas where restrictions are likely to change. Friends in West London and friends in Leicestershire and friends in the Northwest. And just as we do move towards the possibility of meeting indoors and so on, it is really important as you're changing. If you previously told us that you're starting up, but you're starting outdoors and you're switching to moving indoors, please just drop us a line at the membership email address and let us know that you're changing your mode or you're keeping that open as an option. And similarly, if you're one of the groups who's yet to start meeting up again, or even conceivably if you started meeting up again but haven't told us, it's really important that we know, particularly for our insurers, what groups and what activities they're covering. So drop us a line and let us know if you're about to reopen provision for young people, group nights in the next few days and weeks as well. Thank you as well for the feedback that's coming through from that, which is very helpful and gratifying. It's nice to know that we're hitting the mark most of the time. On that note, it's been lovely to see so many of you. I wish I had nicer news for you, but I'll wish you a good night. And if you've got anything you need to take up outside the meeting, my details, Lauren's details, just drop us a line or hit the membership at Woodcraft email address, and we will try and provide the best advice to the best of our knowledge.